Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you decided to join me to take a look at U.S. history. We try to take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles, try to identify the story behind the story. Sometimes we try to look at the odd things that have happened, and certainly examine the personalities that have made the American experience so unique in all the history of the world. In particular, we take a look at the U.S. Constitution, this wonderful document that has governed this country for well over 200 years. And we try to understand some of the complications and some of the problems that we face as a nation, day by day, year by year, month by month. In any event, I hope you're enjoying this and that you come back often, because I will keep repeating these and posting them to YouTube so that you can relive the experience if you want to do it more than once. And I hope you do. Anyway, welcome and enjoy the presentations. This is the second part of Vietnam. And this is the part that runs approximately from 1965 till the very end at 75, when the last troops finally disappear or withdrawn. And before I get too far into it, I want to stop for a second here and to note that this was Lyndon Johnson's failure, if you would. And it's easy to look on it as a bad president, but in fact, he accomplished a great deal. And I think we should pause for a moment and remember how much he did accomplish in the positive side. First of all, he was responsible for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1968, which were revolutionary and changed things and really ended the Civil War, if you would. The Great Society as program, which included urban renewal and modern transportation and clean environment and anti-poverty and educational reform and so forth. The very famous Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has since been too much watered down as far as I'm concerned. He appointed the first Black man, Thurgood Marshall, to the Supreme Court. He did some things in the area of immigration, perhaps not enough, but he did some things. A lot of federal funding for education, which had never taken place before. In part, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, and it poured a lot of money into education. And in fact, the studies that came out of this were what my doctorate is based on, my doctoral dissertation. War on poverty, healthcare reform, including Head Start, food stamps, work study, things that today we take for granted. The Medicare program that all of us benefit from. The transportation efforts, a new transportation department was created. Some things, though not much, in gun control. Space program, first two manned missions, Apollo 7 and Apollo 8, took place during this time. So he did a lot. But what will he be remembered for? He will be remembered for the Vietnam failures. So he sent ground troops finally in 1965. He did not want a full-scale war like World War II. He was trying to avoid that, but he also didn't want to be accused of losing Vietnam, as Truman had been accused of losing China in 1948. By 1965, he actually began to use U.S. ground troops, and Marines were sent to Da Nang. The massive troop deployments saved South Vietnam from falling, but the majority of the rural areas remained communist. The bulk of the combat was now being done by U.S. soldiers. Here's a little video showing U.S. Vietnam, or Marines rather, landing in Vietnam. And they were pretty impressive, and they did good work. Our Marines are pretty tough guys. You don't want to mess with them. Many of these will have maps with words on them too small to see, but if you could read that, you would see the names of battles that you might even remember being in the news. Lac Son and Ai Drong Valley and Doc To, major battles throughout the Vietnam War. Our Vietnam strength increased. As you see, in 1960-63, it was very low. It rose to over 500,000 by 1968. And then with Nixon's election and so forth, it tapered off by 1972. And by 1975, we withdrew completely. The geography of Vietnam made it difficult as a battleground for US soldiers. The land was covered with jungles and rice paddies, making it hard for US armor, including tanks and armored personnel carriers, to move around. Dense foliage prevented aerial observation and allowed the enemy to move around without detection and stage ambushes. It was impossible to even tell who the enemy were, for the communist Viet Cong were integrated into the countryside villages. They could just disappear, change their clothes, and you wouldn't know. The monsoon rainy seasons prevented the effective use of American air power, and we did dominate the air. Vietnam was nothing but a wet, rainy country to fight in. The precipitation was tremendous, and you can't imagine what it's like to have water so that you can really reach out and squeeze it, because it is so much dominating the atmosphere. By the time we get to Operation Starlite in August of 1965, this is the first major battle for the US military. A deserter revealed that the attack was imminent, and Operation Starlite was executed. The ground forces include Marines, artillery, ships and air support, and they attacked the Viet Cong soldiers. And this is where we get, they sustained nearly 700 deaths, while US forces claimed 45 dead with more than 200 wounded. And one of the things I remember, and it was while I was in graduate school in 1968, 67, 68, and I would go to the student union to wait for my ride, and I would hear the evening news, and they would be talking about how, 50 Americans died, but 5,000 Vietnam Cong died. Well, this disproportionate thing didn't do us any good in the long run. It was a river war because Vietnam is filled with lots of rivers. It's very wet. In 1966, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, had the US design and build an electronic wall. The effort was given the name Igloo White, and it was to monitor the remote infiltration on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and to track vehicles and human movement through acoustic and seismic signatures. And they were elaborate ways to protect and build these defensive mechanisms. And this is just and you can't, of course, see the detail here, but I can guarantee you it was very, very sophisticated and expensive, I might add, to build. The map here depicts the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which bordered Cambodia and Laos, and it was used by the North Vietnamese throughout the war since they could retreat across the border, and we couldn't follow them according to international law. But they were free to just come in, do their damage, and disappear. And here is a map that shows Southeast Asia, and there is Vietnam, long and thin, Laos up to the north, which is still quite primitive, and Cambodia to the south and west. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, here's some pictures from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Notice all the water everywhere. The Operation Crimp in January of 1966 was to capture the Viet Cong headquarters, believed to be located in Saigon. Although American forces failed to locate a significant Viet Cong base, they were able to learn about the tunnel system that they had. Teams of American soldiers called tunnel teams were established, and information was given to the troops throughout the country that the tunnels were to be cleared prior to destruction, since the enemy would burrow underground when under attack. Yeah, and they were quite sophisticated. Here is pages from the Combat Tunnel Training Manual from 1966. You see it was, let's try to tell people how to deal. What was the hazard in these things? And here we'll see that in guerrilla warfare, the fighters used the surrounding area and geography of the land, mainly in mountains, jungles, swamps, to hide, set traps, and fight without using heavy weapons. Setting traps and using ambushes to attack the enemies. Some traps were tripwires, punji traps, covered holes in the ground with spike pits with poison-tipped spikes. If you could see the designs on the right, you would see some of how some of them were laid out. And the Viet Cong hid in the trees and swamps and were spread out over a very wide territory. Guerrilla fighters looked like just everyone else. This gave them an advantage when hiding in a town, so you couldn't tell who they were. Here's a Viet Cong soldier sheltering underground, and they also engaged in some bombing. Here are examples of the kinds of traps that they had, and I'm not going to get into the detail of all of these, but some of them are very, very, very clever. And here we see a soldier trying to pull someone out of one of those tunnels. Viet Cong traps used to wound or kill Americans and South Vietnamese soldiers. And here you can see it's like an anthill with sleeping rooms down below, dining rooms that they could use, recreational areas. They had access to water down below, so they were, it was just very incredible the things that they did in these underground tunnels. And the North Vietnamese army entered the war after it had begun to support the Viet Cong. They fought in a conventional manner with tanks, artillery, and infantry tactics. Operation Birmingham. Now we're into April and May of 1966. Notice we're getting a little bit deeper into this with each passing month. The battle took place over 3 weeks north of Saigon. By the way, officially at the end of the Vietnam War, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. However, I have been told in some of the things I have read that the locals still call it Saigon. Anyway, in this battle, the 5,000 US troops, armored vehicles, helicopters, and although they found large quantities of communist supplies, they didn't really keep contact with the enemy. This established the precedent that only time were the major engagements when the Viet Cong decided to attack. The communists were experts at slipping away and avoiding any battle that they didn't wish to fight. They picked their battles. And here you see more of the slogging through the swamps. And we have Operation Hastings. We're into July of 1966. The North Vietnamese crossed the demilitarized zone in late May of 66 and encountered a Marine battalion. The largest battle of the war to date was at Dong Ha. Operation Hastings, Marines backed by the South Vietnamese Army troops and heavy guns, and their artillery and air power drove the North Vietnam Army back over the demilitarized zone in 3 weeks. Again, we won. We're always winning, but we don't win in the end. And here we see a picture of LBJ, who actually came in October of 1966 to visit the troops. Operation Cedar Falls, January 8th, 1967. These two operations took place during the first 5 months of 1967 and were multi-divisional operations conducted according to a preconceived plan, and they resulted in a turning point in the war for a few reasons. They confirmed that such operations do have a place in counterinsurgency warfare, and they brought an end to the enemy's thinking that large-scale operations would be successful. This caused the enemy to revert to smaller scale and more intense guerrilla operations. They destroyed his camps, pillaged his supplies, and killed hundreds of his best troops. They proved to the enemy that his old sanctuaries were no longer safe, which caused him to depend on those located over the border in Cambodia. They helped convince the enemy that the maintenance of large bases and main force units near urban areas was risky business. They raised the confidence of the Allied forces in South Vietnam. Now we knew we were winning. Operation Cedar Falls, goal was to drive the Viet Cong forces from the Iron Triangle, a 60 square mile area north between Saigon and Route 13. Nearly 16,000 American troops and 14,000 South Vietnamese moved into this area. Over 19 days, 72 Americans were killed, victims mostly of snipers emerging from concealed tunnels and booby traps. And while we lost 72, the Viet Cong lost 720. You see, we're winning. Junction City, January 8th, 1967. Up until this point, Junction City was the largest operation. Primary mission was to search and destroy the central office of the South Vietnamese Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army installation. 2 U.S. divisions and as many as 22 infantry battalions, 14 artillery battalions, and 4 South Vietnamese battalions were involved. It's the first major combat parachute assault since the Korean War. Demonstrated the ability of American forces to enter areas that had been Viet Cong sanctuaries. The Viet Cong lost 2,700 troops and the U.S. 282. You see, we're winning. The Viet Cong headquarters, one of the targets, was not captured, and once U.S. troops withdrew, the area was reoccupied by the communists. So we have other nations that joined the battle. We have troops from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the Philippines, South Korea. Here is, for those various nations, troop strength in Vietnam by year. And you see that it goes through that same peak we saw in another trip. But probably the most significant single thing here is that the South Vietnamese troops gradually get, so there are 1 million of them, 1 million South Vietnamese troops when we leave in 1973. Battle of Khe Sanh, April of 1968. The Marine base at Khe Sanh was heavily fortified. The North Vietnamese assaulted the base with rockets, mortar, and artillery and automatic weapons fire. Marine units patrolled the area surrounding the base, but the North Vietnamese were still able to shoot down cargo planes and helicopters. In early February, the Special Forces camp at nearby Lang Bay fell. The fighting around Khe Sanh was widely televised on the evening news, and the U.S. President Johnson and others were determined that Khe Sanh would not turn into an American version of Dien Bien Phu. Although the military victory ultimately went to the Americans, it was a major psychological victory for the North Vietnamese. But remember, when all said and done, we're winning the war, remember. Here's a little map that shows roughly where Khe Sanh is. It's not too far south of the demilitarized zone. And here's our president.
Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win. Make no mistake.
See, we are going to win. So then the Tet Offensive in 1968 was planned by General Giap, commander of the North Vietnam Army, who had planned and executed the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which drove the French out of Vietnam in 1954. During that battle, Giap was willing to lose 10 men for every 1 enemy soldier killed. By the end of 1966, North Vietnam had suffered large casualties in manpower and supplies through the bombing of the North and the fighting in the South. They consider the war was a stalemate. North Vietnam would need a major victory if they would continue on with the war. The primary goals of Giap were to destabilize the Saigon regime and force the United States to opt for a negotiated settlement. And so the Tet Offensive is regarded as a turning point in the war. In October 67, the first stage of the offensive began with a series of small attacks in the rural, remote, and border areas. Even though there were warnings of an attack, more than half of the ARVN, the South Vietnamese, were on leave because of the approaching Tet Lunar New Year holiday. big thing in the Buddhist culture. January 31, 68, a full-scale offensive began with simultaneous attacks by the communists on 5 major cities, 36 provincial capitals, 64 capitals and district capitals, and numerous villages. The U.S. was able to attack the communist forces effectively throughout the country through bombing and artillery attacks. Hue, which had been seized by an estimated 12,000 communist troops who had previously infiltrated the city, remained in communist hands until late February. He reported 2,000 to 3,000 officials, police, and others were executed in Hue during that same time as counter-revolutionaries. The Tet Offensive, the event a turning point in the war because up until that point, Americans were told that the communists were losing. So then question, how could a defeated army launch such a large-scale and effective attack? Americans began to scratch their head and to wonder what was going on here. We're winning, right? The American military scored a victory and the communists were forced out of all the towns and cities, but it was evident that this war could only be won through a greater commitment of men and resources. On March 31, Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election, declared a halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, except for a narrow strip above the DMZ. With U.S. troops already at 525,000, a request by Westmoreland for an additional 200,000 troops was refused. Someone is beginning to wonder whether this is worth it. Here is Westmoreland.
General, how would you assess yesterday's activities and today's? What is the enemy doing? Are these major attacks or? That's EOD setting off a couple of M79 dots, I believe. General, how would you assess the enemy's purposes today?
The enemy very deceitfully has taken advantage of the Tet truce in order to create maximum consternation within South Vietnam, particularly in the populated areas.
See, Westmoreland was a brilliant general, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here's a prisoner who turns out to be a Viet Cong lieutenant responsible for the death of countless civilians. This little snippet that I'm going to play probably will not be able to be put on YouTube because I found that they censor anything that is violent like this, but I'll play it for you here. Yes, part of the bloodiness of the war. So LBJ announced he would not run for president again in 1968. Then we have the Lai Massacre, March 16th, 1968. This Lieutenant Calley, by the way, is still alive. He's about 85 years old. I think he's living in Montana or somewhere. My Lai was entrenched with communists. Charlie Company, led by Lieutenant William Calley, entered the Vietnam village of My Lai. Numerous members of Charlie Company were maimed or killed in the area during preceding weeks. The company engaged in a search and destroy mission, and over 300 apparently unarmed civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, were massacred. Calley ordered his men to enter the village firing, although there had been no report of opposing fire. According to eyewitness reports offered at the event, several old men were bayoneted. Praying women and children were shot in the back of the head, and at least one girl was raped and then killed. For his part, Calley was said to have rounded up a group of villagers, ordered them into a ditch, and mowed them down in a fury of machine gun fire. When news of the atrocity surfaced, it sent shockwaves through the U.S. political establishment, the military's chain of command, in an already and increasingly divided American public. My Lai was used by the anti-war movement to prove that the U.S. had no right to be involved in the Vietnam conflict. North Vietnamese atrocities, by the way, such as the slaughter of South Vietnamese civilians in Cai Bay and Dak Son in 1967, and the massive live burial of innocents in Hue in 1968, were virtually ignored in the United States. And so while My Lai for us was a very bad thing, it was the other side was doing bad things too. After the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong murdered as many as 5,000 South Vietnamese civilians, including doctors, teachers, lawyers, businessmen. And in Hue alone, the communists killed over 3,000 South Vietnamese. This was not widely reported by the press and routinely ignored by the anti-war movement. The United States Army punished its soldiers for wartime atrocities, whereas the North Vietnamese gave medals to those who buried thousands alive at Hue. Cali, by the way, served a very short punishment for his misdeeds. This is the My Lai Monument today in South Vietnam. And so we see at the college campuses, the civil rights movement, which had just been taking off like crazy, mobilized students across the nation. Students for a Democratic Society, a radical student activist movement in the US, criticized the political system of the US, focused on peaceful efforts to promote civil rights movement and improve the conditions of the inner city. However, it became to be known as the leading role that played in student opposition to the Vietnam War. All of these things coming together at the same time. There's the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. 1965, 20,000 people marched on Washington. That's the beginning of large-scale anti-war protests. So we have the free speech movement. The free speech movement. I'm seeing a little notice that says my screen sharing is paused. Is anyone not seeing something dealing with the free speech movement?
It looks like there's a dialog box that should have something in it, but there's nothing there.
Oh, let's see what that's about here.
It's a big gray one right in the middle, right to the left.
But it does it say free speech movement at the top?
Civil rights movement mobilizes students on.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, okay. All right, so maybe I'm okay. I can just keep going here. Anyway, the University of California, Berkeley was a hot place for student protests. Students were fundraising for civil rights in the South, registering voters, and so forth. Berkeley officials stopped the fundraising, citing the fact that protesters in the South were arrested and money could not be raised on campus. Students responded with sit-ins and demonstrations. Over 800 students were arrested for occupying the administration building.
There's no text on the left-hand side showing up.
There's no text. Okay. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the share and start it again, because it suddenly was giving me a funny message there. And I don't know why it was doing that. So let's see. Yes, apparently now we're back, so you can see what I am talking about. I don't know why I did that. It's electronics are funny. They work when they work and they don't when they don't.
Full screen of text on the left-hand side.
Okay, we're good then. Let me keep going then. Okay, so then the Vietnam War at home, demonstrations and civil disobedience. When Johnson began massive bombing against North Vietnam in 1965, the anti-war movement just exploded. And it was in our living rooms every night. Now, television 10 years before this was just really exploding in the United States. And by the late 60s, every single home and business had a television every night, and we had more and more news. Back 10 years before this, we would get on 3 channels, we would get 15 minutes of national news. Well, by the time we get to the late 60s, we are getting on multi-channels. We're getting at least half an hour of news every night. And we began to realize, hey, maybe they're not really telling us the truth about all of this. When draftees, now also the draft is reactivated, and some of you had to deal with that because your number came up. When draftees began to be sent to Vietnam, young people on college and university campuses organized protests like crazy. Over the next 2 years, the anti-war movement, snowballed, and we had these people who became heroes like Abby Hoffman and Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg and Jane Fonda and so forth. The anti-war movement took off like crazy during this period. And these are some of the examples of anti-war posters from the 1960s. And there wasn't a campus in the country that was not affected by this. There were several types of protests ranging from teach-ins to marches to civil disobedience. And here you see a confrontation where the soldiers are trying to control the situation. Now we get to Nixon's Vietnam policy. We get these different things that happened during his 4 years, 5 years actually, as president. The Cronkite movement occurred February 27th, 1968. When CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite declared on air that the U.S. war effort in Vietnam was mired in stalemate and suggested negotiations as a way to extricate the country from the conflict. At the White House that night, Lyndon Johnson supposedly watched the Cronkite program, a special report about Vietnam and the aftermath of the surprise Tet Offensive. Upon hearing Cronkite's pessimistic assessment, Johnson is said to have snapped off the television set and muttered to an aide or aides, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America."
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
That was Walter Cronkite 50 years ago tonight. 33 days later, President Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. Years later, Cronkite reflected on Johnson's decision.
I don't think our broadcast had a principal effect on that, but I think it was a straw on the back of a lot of indications that he was unhappy with the progress of the war and thought he ought to, himself ought to get out.
Of America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day. I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And so that ends. Now, you might also remember the 1968 Democratic Convention. And so Richard M. Nixon became the 37th president of the United States. He defeated Hubert Humphrey narrowly, who had been vice president. Nixon campaigned with a slogan that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. In January of 1969, he promised to achieve a peace with honor His aim was to negotiate a settlement that would allow the 500,000 US troops in Vietnam to be withdrawn while still allowing South Vietnam to survive. 1969 saw some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, led to a massive anti-war demonstration and the announcement of a new policy. The new policy was Vietnamization, and we adopted different training schools and bases to do this. The Vietnamization of the war meant that most of the fighting would be done by the South Vietnamese forces, with the US now beginning to provide support rather than directly being in conflict. Vietnamization involved the improvement and modernization of the South Vietnamese armed forces and training them in techniques for pacification and combat operations. Here are some visual examples of Vietnamization, and it almost worked. It almost worked. So we began to withdraw troops during this period. And so that 525,000 or so in 1969 is down to less than 250,000 by 1970 and a little bit over 150,000 by 1971. And here's Nixon explaining how he's got to do one thing that's not so good, probably, and that is to actually invade Cambodia, which had been a refuge and been causing all kinds of problems. And so in early 1969, Nixon authorizes the bombing of Cambodia to destroy the communist bases. The invasion of Cambodia was US and South Vietnamese troops, the first real test for Vietnamization. The US concluded that South Vietnamese were not up to handling the North Vietnamese, and it would take a long time to develop a reliable fighting force. Domestically, the negative reactions to the Cambodian incursion, including what some of you may have witnessed, is the killing of 4 students at Kent State College in Ohio, and became a reason why Nixon accelerated the withdrawal of US forces from Vietnam. You may wonder, what was the significance of the killing of 4 students at Kent State College in Ohio? It was because US troops, in this case, National Guard, were the ones who fired on our own people. And so when you get our own army firing on our own people, it is a scandal. Here are some maps of the Cambodian invasion. In April of 1970, South Vietnamese troops attacked Cambodia, pushing towards the Viet Cong bases. 2 days later, a force of 30,000 mounted a second attack. This lasted for 60 days and uncovered vast amounts of their supply depot. They captured over 28,000 weapons, 16 million rounds of ammunition, rice, and so forth. And they suffered 10,000 casualties. May of 1970 at Kent State, an anti-war demonstration killed 4 and wounded 8. And it shocked the nation. Vietnamization, unfortunately, did not yield victories. February of 1971, 3 South Vietnamese divisions drove into Laos to attack 2 major enemy bases. Unknowingly, they walked into a North Vietnamese trap. Over the next month, more than 9,000 South Vietnamese troops were killed or wounded. More than 2/3 of the South Vietnamese Army's armored vehicles were destroyed, along with hundreds of US helicopters and planes. 2/3 of America's troops were removed in only 2 years. The ground force was then almost exclusively the responsibility of the South Vietnam, with over 1 million men in its armed forces. The end of Vietnam, last year, 72 to 75. The communists launched a massive offensive. Peace talks, Nixon increased bombing, Nixon cuts troop levels, ceasefire signed, so forth. And finally, we are out of there. So what are we going to talk about here in this period? March of 1972, the communists launched a massive offensive. They hoped to inflict a Dien Bien Phu type defeat on the Americans and force it to sign a peace. North Vietnamese were unsuccessful, however, and suffered high casualties. As a result, the U.S. increased bombing raids over North Vietnam, and we used a lot of the napalm spread all over the countryside, and here is a aerial picture of it being spread. The President Nixon wanted the North Vietnamese to engage in peace talks. He sent them an ultimatum, required them to respond within 72 hours or face the consequences. They failed to respond, and so we began a major bombing. From December 18th to the 30th, the U.S. dropped approximately 40,000 tons of bombs on targets in the Hanoi and Haiphong areas of North Vietnam. Major targets of the operation were radio stations, railroads, power plants, airfields located in this northern area. During Operation Linebacker, Air Force and Navy bombed the area 24 hours a day. The B-52s flew during the night with F-111s, providing support through the strikes on airfields and surface-to-air missiles in the missile sites. Daylight operations were primarily carried out with other bombing and were visual and so forth. By 1972, North Vietnam had 145 MiG fighters and so forth, a heavy concentration of anti-aircraft artillery and a complex overlapping radar network. So they had some resistance they were able to offer. Kissinger, who had been a foreign policy advisor to Nixon, because he then is named as Secretary of State, and he was a representative for the U.S. at the Paris peace talks. He hoped to remove all troops and have South Vietnam remain free from communist control. Nixon's plan of talking and bombing led to results, and so finally, Paris peace talks began to get some action. With pressure placed on North Vietnam, both by the USSR and China, a final agreement was reached in January of 1973. The peace agreement signed in Paris by representatives from the U.S., North Vietnam, and Vietnam took place in late January. In the end, the North Vietnamese achieved their goal because the agreement signed in Paris differed very little from the earlier proposed and rejected settlement in October of '72. Hanoi looked on the Paris agreements as a big victory because U.S. troops were removed, which allowed them to continue the war in the South against only the South Vietnamese troops who had proven no match for the North Vietnamese. They realized that they could reunite Vietnam at a time of their own choosing. So we had the famous incidents of U.S. prisoners of war who have been kept in shockingly inhumane conditions, which violated all the standards of human decency. The United Nations, International Red Cross, and others had asked them to comply with the Geneva Convention, but they were not doing so. And finally, there was a proposal for the release of 8,000 North Vietnamese prisoners in exchange for 800 world prisoners. It says world because it was not only U.S. prisoners, it was from some of these other countries as well. The peace agreement signed in January, they said he brought the American POWs back. Within days, the first of 562 POWs were returning home. Some had been in captivity for more than 8 years. Here are pictures of them coming home, truly joyous. And here are the wives welcoming their POW husbands at home. And this famous flag, missing in action flag, had been flown pretty consistently throughout this period. So these are the human cost of the Vietnam War, U.S. battle deaths from 1960 to 1972. And this is the percent of Vietnam combat deaths by race. Of course, 81% Caucasian, 5.2 Hispanic, 12.5 Black, and 1.2 other races. US deaths in Vietnam, you see, it rose to both, you combine the combat deaths with the non-combat deaths, it was a very costly war in terms of human life. So finally, Vietnam is reunited. The communists continued the conflict, the final offensive, 1975, and the fall of the Vietnamese. It was all over by April of 1975, when communist forces entered the South Vietnamese capital city of Saigon and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam was reunited under a communist government, and it's still a communist government, though a capitalist communist government. The US mission to protect South Vietnam had failed. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Nelson Rockefeller, and Ford discussed the American evacuation of Saigon in April of 1975. And here's the final telegram from the American embassy in Saigon. This is the last helicopter evaluation of the US embassy in Saigon. You can see how desperate people are. They're lined up. And of course, that helicopter is only going to be able to handle a small number of people. In 1975, South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos became communist states. What we never realized was that they were really nationalists as much as they were communists. But then we have one final incident, the Mayaguez incident. Both Kissinger and Ford believed that the US must demonstrate that even after losing in Vietnam, we were still a strong nation that would use military force. In April of 1975, Kissinger told a journalist the US must carry out some act somewhere in the world that shows its determination to continue to be a world power. May 12, 1975, the SS Mayaguez, the last US civilian cargo ship leaving Vietnam, was seized by Cambodian communists called the Khmer Rouge. Cambodia had been taken over by communists in 1975. Even though Ford was told the prisoners had already been released on May 15th, he still ordered military forces to retake the Mayaguez. 41 US soldiers were killed and another 50 wounded when they assaulted a Cambodian island in search of the captives. Of course, they found nothing. The captives were already on their way home. Ford's response to the Mayaguez incident illustrated his effort to show US resolve in the wake of Vietnam. And Pol Pot, leader of the Khmer Rouge, who killed 2 million Cambodians, was deposed in 1978 when the Vietnamese invaded. A lot of people died. The Vietnam Memorial was erected on Veterans Day in Arlington National Cemetery, November 11th, 1978. And then we have this, which I hope you have all visited, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, which contains 58,000 names. And I know some on that wall. And it's an interesting memorial because it is, I found it fascinating that when you first begin to approach the memorial, it is shiny black like a mirror, but you are up at the one end, it comes the same way from either end, where there's only 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 names. And then you go a little further and the list gets longer and longer and longer. And then all of a sudden you reach a point where you suddenly realize that you too are reflected in this black granite wall because you have been involved in this experience. It's a masterfully simple memorial, but very powerful, I think. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of Vietnam 2.